Hello and welcome to the Marshall Assessment Laboratory Scientist Level 6 Endpoint Assessment Guide for Apprentices. In this recording, we're going to talk to you a little bit about the apprenticeship standard itself, how it's developed, and then the assessment plan, where you can find it, and then all the different rules which go into the endpoint assessment, as well as what the hurdles look like and how you can best prepare and how we can support you to get the best possible grade that you can achieve through your endpoint assessment. So as it says here, there is an occupational profile of laboratory scientist that is stored on the Institute for Apprenticeships and Technical Education website. They are the government's arm's length organisation that look after and regulate apprenticeships. And if you travel over to their website for the laboratory scientist, you'll be able to see the occupational profile. If you look closer and further down that page, you'll see the knowledge, the skills, and the professional behaviours that you need to develop whilst on programme at least level 6. And that is how you obviously will contribute to your organisations within your job roles. So you'll see those on the page. And they were created originally by employers known as a trailblazer group. So various different employers who get together and help develop this apprenticeship standard so that the sector can benefit from it. Also in there, and specifically for endpoint assessment organisations like Marshall Assessment, is the laboratory scientist assessment plan. So this is how your endpoint assessment organisation, or EPAO, will go about delivering your endpoint assessment, what the rules are and how they're going to poke and prod you in order to assess you once you are fully competent in the role. So please, if you haven't before, please navigate to that website, have a look through that page, and with close attention when you're coming up towards the end of your programme to the laboratory scientist assessment plan, and have a look through it. But luckily for you, I'm going to talk you through it as well in this recording. So if we focus on your apprenticeship journey, what we refer to as this really long period of time as the practical period, your on-programme development of knowledge, skills and behaviours. You'll also be completing your degree programme as well at the same time, but you'll be learning those knowledge, skills and behaviours in the workplace and being assessed by your training provider, your HEI. So what you will need to work towards and develop is this portfolio of evidence, this vocational competence and evaluation log, which testifies to your ability with those knowledge, skills and behaviours, or KSBs, in mind. You will also need to, by the time you complete, have your English and maths at level 2. So that would be GCSE grade 4, or in old money grade C or above. And if you haven't got one of those, then you would need to have functional skills pass in English and maths. And that's a requirement for all apprenticeship standards above level 2. So everybody needs to have at least that. And then tied into this apprenticeship is the completion of your Bachelor of Science degree. And we need evidence of that before we can then start to assess you. So everything leads up to the last word on that slide, gateway. So endpoint assessment organisations like to orientate, which we're going to do now, those candidates or learners, apprentices, about the apprenticeship assessment process, but also what evidence needs to be collated, because at Gateway, we need to effectively check. So it is a point in time where we check that you have developed all the KSBs, you have your vocational competence evaluation log, you have evidence of your English and maths at level 2, and we have at least, if not a certificate, a proof of claim by your HEI that you have completed your degree. You would need to sign off to say that you are ready to be assessed. Your training provider would do the same. And finally, your employer would also need to agree that you are working at or above the level required in your day-to-day role, and that you are ready indeed to complete your apprenticeship and be assessed. Okay, so there is this assessment plan that I mentioned earlier on the slide from the Institute for Apprenticeships and Technical Education website. And once you have got to that stage and you've got everything that you need, we will sign you off as complete, but there are a couple of other things that we need, as well as the agreement from your employer, the training provider yourselves, and those other things. We will also need a project plan. So part of your endpoint assessment is to complete a vocational project, a synoptic project. And in order to ensure that the project you are going to undertake, once you've completed your apprenticeship and move into your endpoint assessment window, is going to meet the requirements, you effectively submit a project plan along with the other gateway evidence. So the project plan effectively is one of the first elements of your endpoint assessment, and it supports that. So your project plan goes towards the synoptic project with questioning element. So we want to make sure with some bullet points about how your project will meet the criteria for your project. We don't effectively want to get into Gateway and then have a project that doesn't meet the requirements that we have to fail you on. So it's a bit of a safety net. It makes sure that what you're putting your effort and energy into is going to push you in the right direction to be really successful during your endpoint assessment period. So it will ask you about how you are going to meet the various different criteria that you're going to be assessed on. So a good couple of bullet points for each element within the project, that would be really, really helpful. And then we can sign that off, and we can put you through your gateway and move you forward, and you can start working on that project. So if we look at the two assessment hurdles for the laboratory scientist, the first one we just mentioned, the synoptic project report, questioning, presentation, sorry, and questioning. So that is based on, as I said, a vocational work-based project with a minimum of 100 hours work, which should be conducted as part of your normal day job effectively. So it needs to have some kind of impact and support your business. So that's an important feature. It can't be just theoretical. If it's, it has to meet the requirements of your employer. And that will be graded, distinction, pass or fail. So that's the first element. And then the second hurdle that you'll be assessed against will be the vocational competence discussion, or VCD. So this is a professional discussion with you and the independent assessor from Marshall Assessment, and it will be based on that portfolio of evidence that you created whilst you were on programme. So it covers all of the other criteria that are being assessed that are outside of that project. And again, this is graded at distinction, pass or fail. So the percentage or rating for each hurdle is the same. It's 50-50. And the grades are the same for both. So that's what you can expect to experience during your endpoint assessment window. So Marshall Assessment, we have created some guidance documents for you. So hopefully they're being made available to you at the moment, or if not, you can ask your tutors for them, or your skills coaches. So there is a synoptic project guidance document, which takes you all the different things that you need to do for that, to make it really clear. And then obviously reading through it means that if there's anything you're not sure about, you can come back and ask questions either to your training provider or directly to us, whichever is the most well, the best process for you in getting that information. And again, they're very similar document for the VCD. So there's a guidance there, so you know what to expect and how you can properly prepare. So moving on to the to look at the synoptic project report in a bit more detail. You need to carry out this scientific project, and you need to create a report, a scientific paper in the format of a primary journal article. So that needs to be based on your project, and it needs to be very specific to meet the criteria of the endpoint assessment. What you can't do is take your project directly from your BSc, from your degree, and submit that. If you do, it won't hit the criteria that you need it to, and it may well mean that you fail that hurdle. So you need to be able to create something that is very specific towards this part of your endpoint assessment. So the report needs to be submitted to Marshall Assessment at the end of the 2-month period. So you have 8 weeks Once you've formally been accepted through Gateway, there will be a date which you will see. You'll have your project plan approved, and then you'll have 8 weeks to deliver that report to us. So it will be a maximum of 3,000 words. There's 10% leeway on that. It will include an abstract, the main text, figures, tables, and boxes, but the word count doesn't include references. And that should be submitted through to us on a PDF. You can, if you want to, you can submit that earlier, and that might speed up the whole endpoint assessment process, or you can take it right down to the 8 weeks. Do not go past 8 weeks. One of the rules of this particular assessment hurdle is you need to hit that deadline. There could be possibility of you failing if you're late without a very good reason, which has been accepted by Marshall Assessment from that perspective. So timings are very important. Okay, so the project presentation and questioning, you will obviously submit your project through to Marshall Assessment. Your independent assessor will review your work against the criteria for this assessment hurdle. So they're holistically assessing it in advance all the time. They're looking at the criteria that you can see in the assessment plan. So they're kind of assessing it against something you already know about. So it's very clear to you. The copy will also be given to another individual, which will be present during the face-to-face presentation and questioning element. So that will be an individual which is nominated from your place of work, called the technical expert. So the technical expert is there to make sure that where there's any specific information which wouldn't readily be available to an external assurer or the independent assessor, that they can fill in some of those gaps so that the correct assessment decisions are being made. They also have an opportunity to ask you some questions as well, which will be agreed on in advance based on your report, but they won't be involved in the final assessment or grading of the final grading element. So they're there to support, not to formally assess and grade individuals. So how will that day work? What will it look like? So you'll have already submitted your report. It will be at least 2 weeks before you get your endpoint assessment date. So you won't submit your report and be asked to do your endpoint assessment a day or two later. It will be at least 10 working days. And then your presentation should be lasting around 20 to 30 minutes. So anything less than 20 minutes might not go into sufficient detail, and anything over 30 minutes wouldn't be counted as evidence anyway. And again, it's holistically assessed, and you may well answer some of the questions which have already been created because of your presentation. So you could be ticking off more assessment criteria, making life a little bit easier for yourself with a really good targeted presentation to support your report. So following the presentation, we will start asking you questions, and the panel, which is made up of those two individuals, have a maximum of 60 minutes. So it might not always last that long, depending on the number of questions that they're asking you, but that's the most amount of time that you can expect. So it will allow you to demonstrate through questioning the higher grading level criteria. So you'll see from the assessment plan, there are pass criteria and there are distinction level criteria that we are looking for evidence against all the time. So to say the technical expert may ask questions where it's appropriate, but any follow-on questions will be asked by the Marshall independent assessor. Okay, so they will take notes. Don't worry too much about that. If it's online, and many of these today are online, then you might see them looking down at a pad or looking at a second screen. Please don't be put off. What they're doing is they're making their notes so that they've got this really good record. Yes, they also get to go back to the recording if it is done on something like Teams, but they're making their notes, and that might lead them to follow on questions, doing something called check and challenge. Okay, so as I mentioned before, the possible grades are fail, pass, distinction. There are 13 different areas that are being assessed during the presentation and questioning element, from your literature review, the experimental design, data analysis. You need to make sure, and this is in a highlighted color, please make sure that there is some data that you have analyzed within your project. If there is no data, you cannot pass your endpoint assessment. You need to statistically analyze that data. You need to be able to draw conclusions around trends from that data, and then obviously make your recommendations from there. So the assessment plan is very clear. Our guidance documents spell it out. You should know exactly what you need to do in order to pass or achieve distinction within this element of your endpoint assessment. So looking a little bit further on, back to the data analysis, this section corresponds to the knowledge, skill and criteria and behavior criteria in 5 and 14. So you can go back and reference that. It's all about data analysis. You can see that there is within the assessment plan a description of what might mean that what you do to fail. So if you misinterpret data and use inappropriate statistical tools to analyze the data, you will unfortunately fail that section. So if you fail to pass any of those pass criteria, if you fail to meet them and demonstrate evidence, you will fail. We'll talk about what that means in a moment. Then there's the description, the assessment criteria for pass. We've called that P4 so that we know exactly what we're talking about. The wording is exactly as you'd find it on the assessment plan, going back to IFATE. So a well-structured data analysis using at least one appropriate statistical technique, at least, such as probability distribution, significance testing, confidence limits, regression and correlation. So make sure your statistical analysis is at the right level for your type of data and be prepared to justify your use of that particular tool. So what we've done working with some of the employers who have apprentices is we've come up with something that we would hopefully help you to understand what you need to prepare. So data analysis should be well structured, including inspecting, cleansing, transforming and modeling data collected. Look at how that then affects your hypothesis. Example tools could be probability distributions, regression, correlation. So those are the kinds of things we're looking for. If you move over to distinction, again, we've called this D4 for our own use and ease, but what we're looking for from the assessment plan, systematic data analysis using a range of appropriate advanced statistical techniques. So we're looking here for distinction level evidence, really if you're using t-test, chi-square, multivariate analysis, predictive models, something of at least level 6 maths in here. It has to be that, and using a couple of different methods means that, and explaining why they're appropriate to look at the trend in the data is really what we're looking for. So what needs to be evidenced, you can have a read through that. And ask yourself these questions. Have I applied at least one statistical method? Can I apply a second? Think about the distribution of the data, the outcomes. Does it agree with what you expected? How does it influence the development of your project? How does it impact on your hypothesis? How does it impact on your recommendations? So that's what we're looking for, an understanding of all of those different things. So there's also one here for drawing conclusions. Again, link back to the knowledge, skills and behaviours. We've got fail criteria, pass and distinction criteria, what needs to be evidenced. So with drawing conclusions, are they based on my work and my observations, leading it back to the empirical data and drawing those links through your project? Am I able to explain my results and anomalies? What meaningful recommendations can I bring through? And you can see the other things there that we've come up with that will help you wrap your responses, your material around the criteria. So obviously we're not going to go through them all. Another one which I've just bring up is about stakeholder management. Sometimes students may struggle a little bit with this, but for every project, there should be a known stakeholder or group of stakeholders. That could be somebody who is responsible for the output of your reports and your project work. They could be responsible for your time against other duties within your role that you need to negotiate with. They could be individuals that you need to talk to about budget and costs implications of your project work, or somebody that is interested in finding out what you found because they might be doing further project work and research on the back of what you found out. So make sure you identify who your stakeholders are, how you manage information and communicate with them, how you agree how regular that might be, what kind of information gets passed along. Do you need them to authorize things, or can you move on without their authorization? What bottlenecks might it cause if they are authorizing things? So ask yourself, what is your definition within your organization of a stakeholder? How did you bring those individuals into the project and identify them in the first place? How do you communicate? How do you manage them? And how much control do you have in the direction of your project without them or with them? So provide evidence, be ready to provide examples and evidence of that. And that really is how you need to look at all of the different areas within the standard. Okay, so there's one there for change management. Again, I'm not going to talk you through this one. Pause the screen if you want to have a look at some of the detail in there, but it's a very similar theme throughout. Make sure that you've got to focus on the criteria, you understand what you need to do, and then execute that. That's what we need you to do. That's what will get you a good grade within this endpoint assessment. So, what grade do you want? How much scope within your project is there for you to evidence the higher grading criteria? If you say to yourself, well, I only realistically want to pass through this, if you only aim for a pass, you risk not passing. So make sure that you do everything that you can to make sure that you get the highest grade that you can achieve from your project. And that really needs to be aimed at the highest level of distinction. Make sure that between your report and the presentation, as many of those areas are covered as possible, because then for the questioning element, it's just check and challenge. You're obviously very well prepared and you can answer the questions and evidence what you need to evidence. Do practice your presentation. Make sure that the duration is what it needs to be, and make sure that you can speak on each of the items for at least 4 minutes. That basically fills the time. That's what we'd expect. So build your response around the guidance documents, around the assessment criteria, and be ready to answer questions about your project on the day. I guess my last tip for this is some of your projects can get very technical. When you are presenting information that is technical, it's often better to start in layman's terms and discuss and describe things and build up the scientific speak. It's very powerful for an individual who can talk coherently in simple terms about what they're doing, relating it to something that people can understand. And then you can obviously build the complexity within your project and communicate that as well. The reason for that is very easy for people to hide behind acronyms and scientific language, and it's very difficult to make sure that they actually understand what they're saying. If you're building things up from layman's terms into more complex language, then you will have absolute confidence with the assessment team, technical expert, that you know exactly what it is you're talking about. Okay, let's move on to the second hurdle.